Welcome to the Simpleton podcast. We're continuing this week with our investigative journalism. We found a secret society that is taking on the drug cartels, big pharma and big alcohol. They're kind of a subversive organization, and we have a insider who's going to talk to us today, but he only agreed to talk under the condition of anonymity. For simplicity's sake, we will call him Dave. Dave, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for having me.
We are excited to learn about this. And it's my understanding, I think we could start out with something called the 12 steps within this organization. And would you mind telling us what they are or giving us a preface to them? What are they for and what are they?
Yes. So the 12 steps are a series of actions that one takes to recover from an addiction. So depending on which secret society you're a member of, the 12 steps are tailored kind of specifically for your addiction. So
now, do you call it recovery or a cure? Like, are the 12 steps curing you, or what are they doing?
No, it's not a cure. We look at it as though addiction is a disease. So that can be in remission but never cured. So that if I'm a recovered alcoholic, it means that I'm no longer suffering the symptoms of the disease, but I still, if I were to take mood-altering substances, I run the risk of falling back into my addiction.
It sounds like it's talked about the same way cancer's talked about.
I would say that sounds about right. Okay. It's the thing that really connected me to understanding the disease myself is the idea that my body reacts differently to substances than other people's. So the way that we talk about it is that it's an allergy, but it's not an allergy in the sense that I have swell up and go into anaphylactic shock if I drink alcohol. But what happens if I take a drink of alcohol, my body overreacts to that and insists that I have more alcohol. I do the same thing if I take pills, that one's too many and 1,000 is never enough is like the saying, right? Where I can't have just one because it leads me to bad things. I've tried that a few times. And
let me ask a question. We need to get to what the 12 steps are, but the reason why we're going to talk about this on the Simpleton podcast is because we're talking about it as a spiritual, maybe not a spiritual condition, but a spiritual cure,
Yeah.
or
sure.
not cure. We're not using the word cure, a spiritual way of addressing
Treatment.
this problem,
Yeah.
right? Treatment. Now, my question though is just hearing you talk there about allergy or what, this is a little bit of an artificial distinction, as it always is when you divide the mind from the body. But do you think in general that addiction is a physical problem, like genetic problem, or do you think in general addiction is a software problem, like a way that you've kind of created psychologically to cope with things? Do you put addiction either more in that camp of your allergy is actually a psychological coping mechanism, or that this addiction allergy is more like a literal physical, your body responds differently physiologically?
I think the mental aspect is the larger aspect of it, because the way that we talk about the disease is that it's a threefold disease that's mental, spiritual, and physical. It's a physical allergy, but it's also a mental obsession. And if it were just a physical problem, if I just didn't drink or use, I would be fine. The problem is, without a spiritual solution that allows me to not have a mental obsession with trying it again, I'll always, every time, invariably go back to thinking this time it'll be different and I can use safely. It just always happens that way. And it happens that way with all of my friends that are in our secret society, that, a period of time we get separated from our substance that we're addicted to. And it feels like you're just changing your mind, but what really happens is this mental obsession just creeps back in, and, I end up drinking and using again.
So I'm going to ask you to answer this for yourself and also a little bit for what you observe in others. But there's a lot of things in life that can give you a little kick that aren't, drugs or alcohol, right? Like sugar, for example, or maybe exercise, or I don't know what, a video game, or we talk about these dopamine hits based on these like little cell phone games, right? Or social media likes or something, right? Do you find that that whenever your body receives a little positive kick, be it from sugar or a social media like or something like that, that your software, your mind, it has the same like addictive reaction that it does with alcohol? Or is it just separate? Like these alcohol and drugs, like, are you prone to get addicted to everything that's positive? And is that true of addicts in general?
I mean, I think addicts in general are, they're probably more prone to have problems with things that give the dopamine spike than non-addicts, for sure. I don't think that, there are people that have addictions to sugar and have addictions to video games and those kind of things that aren't addicted to alcohol and drugs. So I just don't have any experience with that. But I'm wired to wanting more of almost everything, and it's something that I have to be cognizant of. But for me, some of those things are manageable without the 12 steps as a way to recover from them. Some of them, I need the 12 steps. And what it really comes down to is, do I continue doing things despite negative consequences? You know what I mean? Like, if I were to be addicted to like video games or something like that, to the extent of like not going to work and not taking care of my kids and that kind of thing, and I wasn't able to stop on my own, I'd need to go to a video game recovery society or whatever, right?
Yeah, I've heard another person talk about this, where someone was talking about his addiction, which had led him nearly to kill himself, and the other person's like, well, aren't we all just addicted? I'm addicted to this. And he's like, I never became homeless because I was addicted to video games.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of a different, there's a false equivocation there where it's like, some of these things are just operating at a whole nother level of destructiveness, Right.
Yep. And it happens with substances as well. I mean, there are a number of people that, go through a phase where they are really heavy drinkers and they have a lot of consequences, but when they're confronted with a big enough problem, they're able to stop and turn around and have a regular life, and, not go back to drinking, or they can moderate and, be fine. Brain is a complicated thing. It's different for everybody,
How about we go into, can you kind of tell us what the 12 steps are?
Yep. So step 1 is we admitted we were powerless over, then you fill in the blank for whatever the society is, right? We admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs.
The things that strike me immediately about that is it's very spiritually oriented. It's not like get all that. It's not like step 1, get the alcohol out of your house. Step 2, cut up your credit card or,
Right. Yeah.
And another thing is, it also strikes me that like you could have put those 12 steps in a confessional on a card, and like anyone going to confession could almost mentally go through that process. Maybe it's a little bit too much to do in 5 minutes, but it almost seems like a general way of the way you would reform anything. Am I wrong?
Yeah. No, not at all. I think that there are tremendous spiritual benefits for anybody to take these steps. And especially in dealing with something that you're unable to take care of on your own willpower, that's what it's for. And it is a synthesis of a lot of spiritual wisdom that happened, in the years leading up to listing these 12 steps. None of it is really exclusively new material, It's not like this idea that asking God for help wasn't already out there, but the idea that putting them together in the order that they're put together, and the third step says, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him, makes the door very wide for somebody who might have hang-ups about their relationship with God and religion and everything else, right? It's just like a very, very welcoming and open invitation to do these actions, right? And I think it's really important that it's that way, so that anybody with any kind of faith or lack of faith can feel comfortable in the rooms.
So the newness of this to me is not, I think like you said, this is based on a lot of very old spiritual wisdom. Mm-hmm. If it's new at all, it seems like what's new about it is, by the way, was this written in the 50s or like where in
35.
history do we place it? 35.
1935, okay. Yeah.
So it's coming up on a 100-year anniversary of 12 steps.
Yeah.
Right. It seems like what would be new about it would be that instead of thinking of the abuse of a substance as one sin among many, like, oh, it's just a sin. Some people have that sin. I lie, blah, blah, blah. Right.
Right.
You're kind of like, saying, no, this type of sin requires a special work plan or a special like psychological work plan. And that's kind of where the newness is. It's just saying we need to give this sin a different level of attention and single it out in a special way. Yep. Okay. Yeah.
And the fact that it's a spiritual solution is counterintuitive. You would think, like you said, the first step is just, throw out all the alcohol, throw out all the drugs, and just the novelty of even talking about God as far as a solution to a problem that's, just stop drinking, just stop using, is that novelty, I think, is what really makes it, what makes it unique and what makes it as successful as it is. Because you don't think when I was in my active addiction, I didn't realize that my real problem was my relationship with God, and my spiritual malady, was not the thing that I thought was the problem. The thing I thought was the problem was that I couldn't stop on my own volition, but also that I didn't want to stop,
Well, let me ask about like the process. So like, I've had sins before, and I've not struggled with addiction, but let's just say all sins are a little bit addicting. You have some involuntary sins that you keep coming back to. It could be gossiping or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll get upset, and I sit in a spiritual situation, like in a church, and I think I'm gonna work through this, right? Mm-hmm. My understanding is with these 12 steps, it's not like you hand these 12 steps to someone, they go to adoration for an hour. They work through these 12 steps and they walk out, ta-da, I've now treated myself, or I've now God's now healed me from this,
Right.
Like when you started these steps, how long did it take before you felt like you'd gotten through step 12? Like years, months, days, hours?
Months. So this is a point of contention among people within the various fellowships. You know, certain people will tell you that you need to really take your time, and, you know, they talk about doing a whole lot, like worksheets and stuff like that. You know, there's a lot of different ways that people go about trying to accomplish the steps. My experience is that you're able to do them more than one time. So it's not like you go through 1 through 12 and then you're done and just cured. And, you know, I can go back through the steps. And especially the way that it worked for me was I went through the steps with the sponsor. So I had a guy who had done them before, and he basically showed me what he did, and I went through it with him. And, you know, the first 3 steps are really just propositions. You know, it takes some thinking and some, you know, they deepen over time. But, you know, the first step, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable, is, you know, a yes or no question. And if it's a yes, it's very, very bad news, you know? And I think what was really helpful for me, because I've tried to get sober a couple times before it stuck, you know, I've now been sober for 12 years, a little bit over 12 years. But, you know, what really made it stick this time is that I realized how bad that is, that if I'm powerless over a substance, that means that I don't know where it's going to take me, which, you know, could be if I were to go out and consume alcohol today, I don't know that I wouldn't be okay for a month. And then, you know, at some point end up, you know, coming out of a bender in Mexico with, you know, no money and no ID or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know where it's going to take me. So was your problem going to Mexico and coming back with no ID or anything? No, not yet. I didn't get to that point yet, okay. But it's, you know, that was not off the table. Okay.
Let me, I want to ask a 2-part question to get to kind of like where you were coming from.
Sure.
One is, even today, after 12 years of sobriety, are you married?
I am.
With kids?
Thank God. I have 7 children.
Are there still things with your family, either your nuclear family or your extended family, where things you did over 12 years ago, you're still suffering the consequences from or making up for? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like my wife once said something 10 years ago that was kind of a mean thing to say, and I still bring it up every once in a while.
Right.
As a joke, but
yeah. Well, for sure. I mean, I don't think that there's anything from when I was using that, like, other than the fact that there's a memory there of, you know, times when I wasn't present for my family. And when my wife and I had, you know, a pretty strained relationship, you know, there's memories about that. But I think recovery has allowed us to heal from that so that it doesn't, like, I don't cringe about what I used to do, you know, because I see it as something that I can be helpful to someone else if I share that part of myself, you know, if I am willing to be vulnerable to kind of the darker parts of my story with somebody as is necessary. If they're, you know, they're struggling themselves, it can be helpful, you know? So, you know, one of the lines from the big book says, "We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it." It's one of the, they call them the promises, is one of the promises in that book. And I think that's come true for me, where I'm happy to share my past if I think it will be helpful to somebody.
What are these promises? I haven't heard of this before. I'm not even curious what they are. I'm more curious, like, what is the point of them? Is it like, this is the fruit you're trying to bear? Is this the spiritual space you're trying to get into? Like, what are they for?
Yeah, it's basically talking about that, you know, if you go through this work that's outlined in the steps, that you'll know a new freedom and a new happiness, that you'll have serenity and you won't regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. Fear of economic insecurity will leave you. There's some, there's a number of things, and it's not all the time things, but, for me, almost all the time, I have a new freedom that I never had before I did the steps, and that's a freedom from my active addiction.
So I also want to hear about the 12 traditions of the secret society, but what does a bad day look like when you're an addict for you, Dave? And also, what does a rewarding day look like when you are, are people trying to get cured of addiction for the sake of just not being broke all the time, or not being threatened with homelessness or something like that, or not making other people mad? Or are people trying to get cured of addiction, or cure, once again, wrong word, but because every day is like Disneyland when you get cured of addiction? Can you help us understand that?
Sure. There was definitely, they talk in recovery about the pink cloud is, in early recovery, every day is kind of like Disneyland, because you start living a new way. I don't know if you've experienced people that are like newly sober and enthusiastic about it. And sometimes people talk derogatorily about the pink cloud, like it's like a false thing and it's going to go away. And I think it definitely tempers to a certain extent. But I will say that there's like a fulfillment in being recovered and helping people that, lasts. And it's not the intention of, like, I think the reason people generally get into recovery is honestly to get out of trouble. You hear about getting the nudge from the judge, they get a bunch of DUIs or something like that. Or, their wife threatens to leave them, or husband threatens to leave them, or something like this. It's like, a lot of times people enter just and don't even necessarily even want to quit, but they just want to not be in trouble anymore.
I have to say, like, I think this is perfect corollary for the spiritual life. Like, a lot of people first go to church because they don't want to go to hell.
Yeah.
And then there's often a lot of consolations, which I do think are not inauthentic. Like, I do think God has this whole thing rigged this way. Like, what you're calling the pink cloud sounds to me like grace and consolations.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then the long Christian life is a satisfaction of purpose and meaning, as opposed to like a bunch of like Twinkies, a bunch of like consolation Twinkies,
Yeah.
But like, how does this then, like, given that I just made that comparison, you're not of this secret society is not a church.
That's right.
Right. So how has this affected like your faith? And if you don't mind even sharing what your faith is, like how has this worked either hand in hand or opposed, or however you want to express it with your faith?
So the short story for me, I'm Catholic. And at the time that I entered recovery, I was, culturally Catholic, where I would go to Mass, Christmas and Easter, and maybe some other times during the year. Our children were baptized, but I certainly wasn't, actively engaged in my faith. I hadn't been to confession in like 15 years or something like that. And when I got into recovery, it was a really broad, that thing I said about, a God of our understanding, that broad door opened me up to thinking of, that maybe there is a God, that cares about us, but certainly wasn't, thinking that it was even a Christian God or any, I had a very like kind of new agey, maybe kind of thoughts going on when I first came in. And what happened for me was I, was open to this idea that there was a God, and I went through the steps. And then when I got to the step where you admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs, and I did that with my sponsor, in the book, it talks about, some people do that with a member of the clergy. And I had been to confession before, and I thought, that maybe I should try to take that to a priest in confession too. And that was definitely just a very grace-filled prompting, I think, from the Holy Spirit.
Now, when you did that, did you just get in a confessional line, or did you warn the priest that you were going to dump 45 minutes of stuff on them and like make an appointment?
Oh, no, this was great.
I've heard people try to do a general confession by just getting in a confessional line and getting kicked out and be like, you got to come back someday, man. You can't tell me your life story.
No, this is even better than that. So I went to Mass on an Ash Wednesday. And then after Mass, I just asked the priest, like, hey, can you hear my confession? Because like, I didn't know what priests have time. Priests aren't doing anything on Ash Wednesday. Right.
They're not busy.
And then I get, oh, God bless this priest. I don't even remember who he was. I go in there and I'm like, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 15 years since my last confession, and forefront of my mind, all the very worst things that I had ever done, and just threw them up all over. And I still remember the priest like being like, I think my penance at the end of it was like, you just need to do what your sponsor tells you to do, which was a good one. And then after the confession, there was, of course, like a very long line of people that had then formed, so I'm sure I made that priest day. But the thing that really that confession was a real big turning point for me back to the church, because I understood God as being a father, right? Where, one of the propositions in the book is that, God is like a father, he loves his children. And I was a father and I had children, and I knew what it meant to love your children. And I knew that the idea that, God would love me no matter what was really great. And so I said that to the priest in the confession, where I was like, I get the idea of God being a father, but I don't understand like what Jesus has to do with that. And I remember he kind of like chuckled a little bit, and he was like, the only reason you understand God as a father is because of Jesus. And I was like, this like major light bulb went off, And so that was really a big turning point for me, back to the faith.
So I work with a lot of addicts, and they all, in a sense, love their children, and in a sense, it's always very disappointing. Like they will like be literally losing their children to the state and crying about and tearing their heart out about how much they love their children, how they die for their children, but then they just don't show up the next day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, and I don't, in a sense, doubt the authenticity of their emotion. Right. Yeah. But I also know that that's just not going to help your kid.
Right.
So have you felt like as a father that like your relationship has changed?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main aspects of addiction is selfishness. And that when I'm in active addiction, I'm only thinking about myself, and I'm only thinking about what I can do to make me feel better. If, I have warm feelings towards my kids and I can show up for them and it doesn't keep me from participating in my addiction, then I'll make time for them. But if it comes down to, my addiction or my kids, I'll choose my kids. Like one of the big things that I really felt terrible about in early recovery, and it's still like one of those things you were asking about, like, do you look back on things and regret them? I mean, like, I wish I hadn't done this, but thank God nothing bad happened from it. But like, I would tell my wife that I need to go work in the garden and go smoke weed. And then she would come out and say, hey, let's go to the pumpkin patch or whatever, right? And she'd load the kids up in the car, and I would insist on driving even though I was high, because I thought that was what I needed to do, and I didn't want to get caught, being high. And, it's just this kind of like, it's not you can't really make sense of the logic of it, but it's like, I did that, a number of times where I would put my family in danger so that I didn't look bad or didn't get caught or, didn't have to look at what I was doing or whatever. So recovery helps me not to be selfish. And I'm certainly, still a flawed human being. I'm still a sinner. I still am selfish. I don't always want to, recovery doesn't make me perfect, but it gives me, a concrete steps that I can take, actions that I can take to stay on the right path. And then when I screw up, when we're talking about the 10th step, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Like, I love that step, because even when I knew I was wrong, I would think it would just go away on its own or something if I just ignored it, but really, like, taking ownership helps all of my relationships, especially with my kids, so if I give in to anger and yell at my kids, I'll, come back and say, listen, I was wrong. I shouldn't have yelled at you. You still shouldn't have put whatever. Today's episode is you shouldn't have put nail polish all over the furniture in the hallway, but I shouldn't have yelled at you, right?
Why shouldn't you yelled at him?
Well, maybe not yelled at, but like
you lost the temper or something. You lost a little bit of control or something. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, right.
Yeah. I just want. I'm kind of big on. I feel like there's this idea floating around now, particularly maybe in our generation, of violence is always wrong, or expressing yourself that way is always wrong. And I don't know that it is.
No, I think you're right.
I think it has its place, but
right. I shouldn't have kept yelling at you, I guess, maybe,
Yeah, I've had to apologize for this too. So one thing about these 12 steps was I didn't hear anywhere in there that you should go to meetings.
Right.
And I didn't hear the word sponsor in there either. Right.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine this secret organization functioning without the meetings and the sponsors. So where does that come in? Is that in the traditions?
A little bit in the traditions.
How about you read us the traditions and then we'll kind of try to fit it together.
Okay, sure. All right. The first tradition, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon the fellowship's unity. 2, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. 3, the only requirement for membership to the fellowship is a desire to stop drinking or using. 4, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or the fellowship as a whole. Each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic or addict who still suffers. 6, a fellowship group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the fellowship's name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. Every fellowship group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. The fellowship should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. The fellowship as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. The fellowship has no opinion on outside issues, hence the fellowship's name ought never be drawn into public controversy. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. And 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities.
So that's interesting. So these are kind of the 12 steps are kind of like the recovery plan. And these 12 traditions are kind of like the management philosophy.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And those last couple are interesting because, like, one of the things I've noticed with all the members of this fellowship I've met is they don't do what every other marketing agency does. Right. Like somebody should sit down and say, here's why it works. Here's the fruits. You see our competition over there, be it harm reduction, be it whatever. Here's some problems with that we're trying to solve over here. Right. Like kind of promote. Mm-hmm. Right. And these last two traditions stress anonymity and like basically not promoting.
Right.
You know, which is kind of wild. And it's also wild that you guys have kept on. You know, I mean, It's going on 100 years, right? So,
yeah. No, I think there's a lot of wisdom to the traditions because, you know, and I'm not a recovery history guru, but there have been groups that have promoted, you know, that kind of received a lot of success and then kind of flamed out and you don't know about them anymore. One of them was the Washingtonians was one. I don't know if I know about them because I'm,
You mean the state of Washington, right?
the state of Washington.
Right.
Exactly. But anyway, so like this idea that it's an invitation, the wisdom in it is knowing the target audience, right? Like, I think if addicts and alcoholics were met with a full frontal assault of like hard sell marketing, if problems were encountered, they would, like if people didn't get sober or whatever, they would just, I don't know, it wouldn't work. Like it wouldn't work as well as it does because
I think that the people who are getting the hard sell marketing are the government and the families of the addicts, Yeah. And it's very interesting to me to see how, if you listen to the traditions that you say, you guys are going to basically fund yourself. Like I've heard it said, like, if we can afford to buy a beer at the bar, why can't we afford to fund this group? Like, we don't need a grant. We don't need other people to be paying for this fellowship. Right.
Yep.
But then there's so much money in addiction and recovery. And I'm saying this from my Simple House perspective. I'm saying this as someone who's firsthand witnessed this. Like, if you could make people sober for $250,000, 30 days and $250,000, you will be sober. You would have people lining up around the block. You would have people giving loans, like mortgages, to get sober, and $250,000 is the low end. Like, you could probably raise that price to $500,000 to $1 million. And there would still be, it's that important to be sober when you're an addict that there is no price too high, basically. And parents would be paying it for their kids 100%. Right.
Yeah.
So because there is that dynamic, because the value of sobriety actually is spiritual, but it's also straight up economic, like you're not going to lose your job, et cetera, these addiction centers can name their price, and they don't seem to have any better results than the organization that's doing it for free. And Dave, you don't have to back me up on this. I'm saying this on my own, authority, but like, and half the time it appears that their whole program that they have at the addiction center is a ripoff of the 12 steps. Like, they're literally doing a 12-step program, but doing it for money as opposed to for free. And they're losing some of the traditions because it's kind of, even things that are not for profits end up being for profit.
Yeah.
Like you just get a group of people who have a special interest in keeping that thing going.
Sure.
Anyway.
No, totally. And, I think, there's definitely a place for people going to, inpatient treatment. I ended up getting into recovery from an outpatient treatment place. But yes, it was essentially, some group therapy along with, you need to get in a 12-step recovery program and, get a sponsor, start working the steps, is pretty much the course of action to take. So I think the thing about it just not being promotional to the addict is that it gets them to buy into it without feeling like they were sold something. And so like that ownership of like, I believe that this is going to work. And it was only from somebody else sharing their experience rather than being told what to do, is I think what reaches addicts, because we addicts are very stubborn people and don't like being told what to do. And we don't like
it also makes you guys sound like you're teenagers. Like,
we are.
You don't want to listen to your parents. You're sneaking around doing stuff.
Oh yeah.
And therefore you can't tell teenagers what to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that people in recovery talk about is that, you stop maturing when you start using, and that I think is really true to a certain sense, because I only know myself as an addict, but like I've had very teenager-esque responses to things not going my way. And like, that's why the steps are so great, is because it gives me an opportunity, like when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Like maybe people that aren't addicts don't need that and really just like being raised by good parents and having, good upbringing, they just internalize that. But like for me, I had good parents, I had good upbringing, but like I was unwilling to admit I was wrong, and it's like, it forces me to take these actions that are contrary to what I want to do that end up being of great benefit to me. So
has the fellowship truly become worldwide? Like, are there meetings in China and, Russia and all these different places?
Yeah. I mean, I know especially now with Zoom, you can actually, I've done Zoom meetings in Scotland and Ireland and Australia.
The English-speaking world doesn't surprise me that it's reached all that. I'm kind of wondering, has it gone to the far reaches?
Yeah, so I've got a friend of mine that he actually started a thing in Africa where they have recovery. They have like a treatment center type thing, and they also have places where they facilitate meetings in Africa. So it's, I can't speak for everywhere because I don't know, it's, like China or, some of those places. But I think, if there's, especially with the internet, I think there are people in recovery doing 12-step fellowship meetings everywhere.
Are there any cryptic signs of the fellowship? Like in my neighborhood, I think there's a building that has a big teapot on the door. Okay.
I don't know that one, but I know like there's definitely symbols, a circle inscribed with a triangle is one. Circle inscribed with a square is one, for a specific fellowships. After you've been in recovery for a little while, if you start talking to people and they say there's definitely certain things that people say, like if they start saying, we're big on slogans, like one day at a time, or easy does it. It's not necessarily a dead giveaway that the person's in recovery, but the kind of antenna go up when you start hearing stuff like that.
So because I've worked with so many addicts, I've had people like push back against the fellowship, right?
Sure.
And the pushbacks have been like, oh, I did that once, and they stole my girlfriend, or I did that once, and those people are insincere, or I did that once, and they're all about just switching your addiction from this to the meeting, or, and like when you hear some of these objections, you're just like, well, that was just one bad experience, or, okay, do switch your addiction from this to the meeting, because that would be great if you could do that.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But it is interesting, the animosity that I hear sometimes about it. Where do you think that comes from?
There's a couple of aspects to it. I think there's a serious spiritual aspect to it. Is the solution to the problem that the person is. There's a strong spiritual force that doesn't want them to get into recovery. It's the addiction, almost being sentient and knowing like, this is what's going to work for me. We need to stay away from this. I think part of it is there are bad members of all fellowships, that sometimes there are people that do bad things and don't carry the message as they should. Or
does the fellowship have a way of policing misbehavior by its members?
No.
Like let's say there's a guy trying to always hit on newly sobered girls.
Yeah.
Right? Do you have a way to do you guys beat him up or?
So there's no real structured penalty system or something like that. It's just all self-policing kind of things, And if you're in good groups and somebody starts trying to do stuff like that, somebody will go up to them and confront them about it. There are times when you have to get a group of people to confront somebody about something. And sometimes people are, belligerent and need to be removed from a meeting when they're, yelling or carrying on or something like that. That's super rare. I think I've only ever seen it one time myself, but I've heard of other things where, things have happened. But there's no codified set of rules or.
You said something in the process of explaining this that you said good groups, which implies there's bad groups.
Sure.
Right. So what is if someone's thinking about this or wants to recommend someone to this, what's it mean to have a good group or a bad group, and what's the difference?
Having a good group is people that are focused on the solution of the steps of recovery and aren't focused on the problem. So there are some groups that, you'll go to meetings that you'll hear all people are kind of telling glory days type of stories and, wasn't it funny when, we drank a case of beer and stole a goat or something, whatever. And I'd say especially like there might be groups that have people that are hitting on young women, or that kind of thing. So I think the way to find good groups is to, go to meetings. I think in almost every group I've ever been a part of, or every meeting I've ever attended, there have been good people in those meetings. And I think, but some groups just aren't as good at policing the bad actors, I guess, as others are.
I think there's something to remember here that, like, even at your church, you want sinners in your church.
Yeah.
You want,
for sure.
You want these people who are problematic. That's actually the point.
Yeah.
Is to try to figure them out. But if you can't help them, you got to kick them out. But
yeah. And I think, like, for when I say bad groups, it's not even necessarily like there are some that are more focused on the solution than others, and for me, what I would say somebody should do is, go to a number of different meetings, check out a number of different ones and, try to find one that really speaks to you and find somebody that seems like they're happy being sober, and when you find that person that you think is happy and comfortable being sober, ask them to be your sponsor. And, what that means is, that they'll take you through the steps, but also kind of be a sounding board to call them and ask them questions about stuff. No sponsors permanent, it's not like you enter into a contract, but having somebody to help kind of navigate where a good place to go is important, So, in my experience, I haven't had a whole lot of experience with bad groups, but there are, and this is my opinion. This isn't the opinion of any fellowship or whatever, but there are some groups that have a very negative opinion on people taking medication for mental illness. There are some people that would say you're not really sober if you're taking Zoloft or whatever.
Well, I think let's just kind of summarize that to say it's kind of crazy to tell people to get off their meds. It's also, though, partially a reaction to the overreach right now that it's undeniable that we're overprescribing.
Absolutely. Right.
So,
yep. So, but for me, I would characterize a bad group as being one that has an overarching thing of you're not sober if you are taking meds,
I would like to bring up another issue, though, and I think this issue is true in all church groups. There's some church groups that are so accepting that we talked about this with an interview with Garrett, who goes through same-sex attraction. Everybody should go listen to that podcast if you haven't already. It's some people's favorites. He talked about people who were hard on him, who kind of smacked him with look, everything you're dealing with same-sex attraction is wrong, unnatural, blah, 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 boom, boom, boom. And then there were other people who are just God loves you.
Yeah.
And this is true in every little church organization, that there's this spectrum between being hard on people and being soft on people. And
for sure.
And I can't even tell. I don't know that we do know that the extremes of those spectrums wrong, but we don't know where in the middle. I knew a Hispanic guy who actually ended up being an addiction counselor who said that he wouldn't go to the Spanish speaking AA group in his area because they were very hard on you. Yeah. And instead he would go with these older African-American guys because they were very accepting and loving of him. And that just worked better for him, Yeah.
And, I think in one way, the way that these groups are disorganized, and when I read the traditions, there's some stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, where different flavors of the fellowship work better for some than others. And, in the same way that in my faith and Catholicism, certain people's spirituality, a very austere, penitential spirituality, is very fruitful for them. For other people, it's not. Some people really respond really well to a sponsor that tells them, you need to do exactly this today. You need to, call me every day at 3:00, and you need to make a list at the end of the day of, if there's anybody that you've harmed or something like this, right? Some really strict sponsorship, right? Some people really respond to that and get sober that way. that wasn't my experience. So that's what's great, is that you have this opportunity for like a spectrum of what works. But then I guess to say that there's also just bad actors in any group, and, you know, sometimes people take that stuff too far and, you know, can get really out of whack with their relationships with people. And, you know, like I see that with the sponsorship thing. Sometimes, you know, there's some people that like have this like deification of their sponsor almost, where it's like,
right. Let me ask you about that in general, because there's this theme in our podcast that has to do with evangelization, in that like at one side of a spectrum would be discipleship, and on the other side of the spectrum would be like a pure accompaniment. And the discipleship might be much more like a director, or like, I am ahead of you, I know the truth, and I'm giving it to you. I'm teaching you as a disciple is taught, right? And a company would be more like, we are fellow travelers, and I will try to, you know, walk with you while you're on this path, right? Are you kind of saying that is one of those ways more in tune with the fellowship than the other, or are they just both alive and well in the fellowship? And what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that the initial pitch of the fellowship is an accompaniment pitch, you know, and then the deeper you get into it and the more you buy in, the more that discipleship side of things, you know, kind of kicks in, where it would be, you know, it's like that thing of, you know, you can do whatever you want, but it's very, very clear what the right thing to do is. For example, like gossiping, people would say things in the fellowship like, it's been my experience that gossiping is, you know, not good, you know, and it's harmful to me and to my recovery. You know, it's kind of like this insinuated, like, but you do what you want. When people start insinuating that stuff, the further along you get, the more it feels like somebody really telling you what to do. You know what I mean? Like, we kind of have a way
in a good way, though, right?
Exactly, in a good way.
And so that does sound more like accompaniment, though. Like, as it works for me, is this, you know?
And that's very much the language of recovery, is accompaniment.
I think everyone knows that like Simple House is much more in the realm of like walking with people as opposed to like dictating.
And you know what I mean? And I think there is, like, especially for people that are really new, like, some people need to be told in no uncertain terms, like, you can't hang out with your friends in the crack house. Like, you can't, you know, like.
Yeah, I know. I laugh because I have seen that in my own ministry, that like that. Right. So stupid, but that's like the addiction being almost sentient. The addiction's like, I don't need to win this argument. All I need to do is get you to hang out with your friends in a crack house, and we're gonna be fine. You know?
Yep.
So.
Yep.
Oh, I know. I have one major question we have to address. All right. So what we've already talked about is how people are attracted to the fellowship because they meet people in the fellowship who it's worked for, right? And there's no hard sells, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's people listening to this podcast who have family members deep in addiction. Yeah. And they're looking for ways to help or to get them into a fellowship or something, right?
Yeah.
What do we tell them? Because, I mean, they're not supposed to hard sell, but what then are they supposed to do, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Well, like, one thing, there are 12-step recovery fellowships for family members of addicts and alcoholics. There's that. My wife has made great use of those, and they really help. One of the main things that they talk about is, you know, someone else's addiction, that it's the 3 C's. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. And so my first thing would be to invite a loved one to find one of those fellowships and seek that out. I guess the biggest thing, because I have people in my life that are in recovery now that, you know, I've had to deal with the frustrations of seeing them continuing to use after it's become evident to everybody but them that they need to quit. And the big thing about that is to not enable them. You know, the enabling thing of, don't buy them alcohol. Don't, you know, you don't have to serve them alcohol. You know, if people, like when people come to my house, if there's someone, you know, that I feel like it's irresponsible of me to serve alcohol, then I will have a dry evening or something like that.
Everything you talked about enabling right here was very direct. Basically, don't give alcohol, right?
Right.
Which, that sounds obvious. I hope the whole audience sees that as obvious, right?
Yeah.
My thought, though, is that, like, in running our ministry and trying to educate our missionaries, it's like everything's enabling if you take it far enough, like buying this guy a cup of coffee or making his life a little bit more comfortable while he's homeless or something like that. Right. Like, and I have to say, look, we're always going to be okay feeding. We're always going to be okay doing this. We're never going to give cash because we don't want to enable, Right. But this enabling thing gets out of control and becomes a reason to just not be charitable.
Yep. No, for sure. Yep. And I think that for me, in dealing with guys that I've sponsored or guys who I'm just new people that I'm talking to, that I'm maybe taking to meetings and stuff like that, it has everything to do with if they're meeting you halfway, or not even halfway, like if they're just like facing your direction, where it's like, if the guys really seems like they want to get sober or interested in learning more about getting sober, like, I need to make it, it's incumbent upon my recovery that it needs to be a little bit uncomfortable for me. I need to be willing to do things that are inconvenient to help that person. And the beauty of recovery is that those things are the things that help me stay sober, is, doing those things that are inconvenient for me. But, and it's a judgment call, and it's something to be aware of. Like, if you think they're just calling you to, get a bunch of free lunches and, they have no intention on trying to get sober, then, maybe I would say, look, I'll take you to the meeting. We can't go out to eat, or, I can't pay for your lunch or whatever. And, it's have a willingness to set boundaries. But, one of the other things they talk about in the family groups are not amputating the relationship. Like, it's not like you just cut the person off and never talk to them again, but that you have these boundaries.
I think maybe that's the best advice, is to send people to these family groups, because a lot of what you and I do is not within our intimate family dealing with the addict. You know what I mean? And there's going to be people who listen to this who end up having to kick a kid out, or who have to end up, moving out of a spouse role relationship because the person's damaging the family so much with the addiction, Right. And those types of things are probably not things you and I can give advice on here at the end of this podcast, but go to the family group, talk it through, and there's going to be people there who have experience kicking kids out and trying not to shut down the relationship,
Right. But they have experience with setting the boundaries, but being peaceful in themselves, in, knowing that it's the other person and it's their addiction that's causing these consequences.
Right. Because these people will not only know the right course of actions, they can be your support and get your head right, so you're not overly blaming yourself or doing counterproductive stuff or beating yourself up all the time.
Yep. And, it's when you take people's opportunity to experience the consequence of their decisions away from them, that they don't have any consequences, then they're not going to be motivated to do anything different. For me, I wasn't motivated to try to get sober until, my family had an intervention for me. Right. And, I really, my mother-in-law telling me how much it hurt her to see me this way. And, she really kind of let me have it about, think about your children. And, for my wife to really make me feel as though if I didn't change, that our, marriage potentially was not going to continue. So
there was a tough love dynamic that was necessary.
Yep. And just this boundary of like, you can't, we love you too much to let you continue hurting yourself, but the hard part about that is, that, sometimes, thank God for me, I entered recovery after that. Sometimes people don't get right into recovery, and you have these tough relationships and tough consequences where you have to have strains in the family. And like you said, those family groups have people that have experience with that can really help navigate those waters.
I have to say, at Simple House, I'll meet donors, and the donors will take me aside and tell me that they have a friend, a child who's homeless.
Yeah.
Wow. And they'll say, I tried this, I tried that, and they'll donate to us, because there's also this thing that happens that everyone should know, that sometimes it's easier for someone outside the family to help the person than the family.
Yeah.
And I say that because the outside person isn't as manipulatable or as damageable as the family is. Like, I can deal with someone's chronic alcoholic father, and he's not going to hurt my feelings.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But when his own kids try to help him get sober, he just hurts the relationship more and more and more, you know?
Right.
So,
no, for sure. Yeah.
So there's this role for these outsiders that's often necessary. And I hope Simple House has played that role for families in the past. But all right. Well,
absolutely. Yeah.
Dave, I want to thank you. I wanted people, I think the purpose of this episode that I'm hoping we achieved is, we need people to know that there is a secret organization fighting big alcohol, big pharma, and the drug cartels, and they can join it if they want to.
Yeah. Yep. And it's benefited my life so much, you know, that I'm as happy now as I've ever been because of it. And it was hard, and it's worth the hard work. So I would just say an invitation to somebody to, you know, really give it a shot. There's one of the saints has a saying that's, you know, the spiritual life, or no, maybe it's Chesterton, you know, spiritual life hasn't been tried and found wanting. It just hasn't been tried, or something like that. You know,
yeah.
Most of the time that people have opinions about these fellowships, it's not that they've actually done it. You know, it's that they've kind of got opinions without doing it. So my thing with new guys is always, you know, why don't we just do an experiment? Even whether you believe there's a God or not, you pray for a week and report back to me how it's going. You know, you start doing this stuff and just do it like seriously, like a scientific experiment. You know, like, let's see how my life looks like if I wake up and ask God to help me stay sober today. You know, and report back. And if the evidence of that report is that things are getting better, let's continue doing this, you know?
Yeah. My dad used to tell people that if they said, how do I know if there's a God, or I'm having a problem believing there's a God, he would just say, well, all you have to do is just ask God to prove himself to you or show himself to you, and just do that, and he will.
Yep.
And there's multiple people who've come back with the weirdest stories about how that worked out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, for sure. As a Christian, you know, like, we can't be afraid of the truth, you know? So, like, let's take a deep dive into what the truth is, you know? And, you know, we can't be afraid to try to have an experience with God, you know, for fear that God won't meet us there, you know? Just like, but that's the hard part, is that, you know, it's hard to take that first step, but, you know, God always has overdone himself in meeting me whenever I've been willing to be vulnerable and ask for help.
That's great, man.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, or whatever your name is, thank you for this interview, and I hope you get back to your secret projects.
Yes, we'll do.
All right. God
Thanks,
bless,
Clark.
man.
Thanks for having me. You too.